January 17, 1945, Manila, Philippine Islands. The air hung thick with smoke, and the acrid smell of burning wood as the American artillery continued its methodical advance through the shattered streets of Manila. In a basement beneath what had once been a municipal building, 32 Japanese women huddled in darkness, their hands trembling as they clutched crude wooden clubs and broken bottles. They were nurses, clerks, comfort station managers, and auxiliary personnel, women who had followed the Imperial Army across the Pacific, believing in the divine mission of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Now, as boots thundered on the floor above them, they prepared for what they had been taught was inevitable, a fate worse than death itself. Nurse Kimiko Tanaka, 23 years old, pressed her back against the cold concrete wall and whispered a prayer to her ancestors. In her pocket, she carried a single cyanide capsule given to her by an army doctor 3 months earlier with clear instructions. "The Americans are demons," he had told her, his face grave in the lamplight. "They will defile you, torture you, parade you through their streets. Death is mercy." She had believed him completely. Every fiber of her conditioning, every propaganda poster she had seen, every story whispered in the barracks had painted the same picture. American soldiers were savage beasts who raped and murdered women without mercy, who took particular pleasure in humiliating Japanese captives. Better to die with honor than face such degradation. The door burst open. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Kimiko's fingers closed around the capsule. This was the moment. She began to lift it toward her lips. "Hold your fire, women and children." The voice came in English, sharp and commanding. Then impossibly in broken Japanese, "Dejabu, Anzan desu, you are safe now." What happened in the moments, days, and weeks that followed would shatter every belief these Japanese women held about their enemy, about warfare, and ultimately about the ideology they had served. Their encounter with American military captivity would become one of the most quietly transformative episodes of the Pacific War, a collision between propaganda and reality, so profound that it would haunt the women for the rest of their lives, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about the empire they had served and the enemy they had been taught to fear and hate. To understand the shock these women experienced, one must first comprehend the psychological fortress that Imperial Japan had constructed around its people, particularly its women. The indoctrination began young, woven into every aspect of education and culture from the 1930s onward. Japanese schoolgirls learned that Western nations, particularly America, represented materialistic decadence and moral corruption. The Americans were portrayed as racially inferior, as barbarians who lacked the spiritual purity and warrior ethos of the Yamato race. This wasn't casual propaganda. It was a totalizing worldview, reinforced daily through radio broadcasts, newsreels, schoolbooks, and community meetings. For Japanese women serving in military capacities, this indoctrination intensified. By 1944, approximately 170,000 Japanese women were directly attached to military operations in various support roles. They served as nurses in field hospitals, administrators in occupation headquarters, laundresses, cooks, and communications operators. Some managed comfort stations, a euphemism for the brothel system that followed Japanese forces across Asia. Others worked in intelligence or propaganda departments. These were not combat soldiers, but they were nonetheless considered part of the military apparatus, subject to military discipline and military ideology. The Imperial Japanese Army issued explicit instructions regarding capture, a document discovered after the war, titled Instructions for Female Auxiliary Personnel in Combat Zones, stated clearly, "Capture by the enemy brings dishonor worse than death. If capture appears imminent, you are expected to take your own life to preserve the honor of the emperor and the purity of Japanese womanhood." This wasn't merely suggested, it was mandated. Women were issued cyanide capsules or instructed in methods of suicide. They were shown propaganda films depicting American atrocities, most of them fabricated or wildly exaggerated. They were told that American soldiers, deprived of women during long Pacific campaigns, would gang rape any Japanese female they encountered, then murder her once they tired of her. This propaganda built upon genuine cultural fears. Japanese society placed immense value on female purity and family honor. Sexual violation wasn't merely a personal trauma, it brought shame upon entire family lines. Moreover, the propaganda played upon racial anxieties that had been cultivated for decades. Americans were depicted as seeing Japanese people as subhuman, as racial inferiors who deserved no mercy or respect. Given the racist treatment Japanese immigrants had received in America during the pre-war years, and given the genuine savagery that had characterized some Pacific Island battles, these fears didn't seem entirely unfounded. What the Japanese women didn't know, what they couldn't know, given their complete isolation from outside information, was that the American military had implemented strict policies regarding the treatment of enemy civilians and non-combatant personnel. The Geneva Conventions, while imperfectly applied, nonetheless created a framework that most American commanders took seriously. More importantly, there was a practical consideration. The Americans desperately needed intelligence about Japanese positions, supply lines, and troop movements. Mistreating prisoners, particularly non-combatant prisoners who might be cooperative, made no strategic sense. But perhaps most significantly, there was a simple human element that Japanese propaganda had completely failed to account for. Most American soldiers, when confronted with terrified women who posed no threat, responded with basic decency. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, shopkeepers' sons from California. Many had mothers, sisters, sweethearts waiting back home. The sight of frightened women cowering in basements didn't trigger the sadistic impulses Japanese propaganda had predicted. It triggered something else entirely. When the American soldiers found Kimiko Tanaka and the other women in that Manila basement, the first shocking deviation from expectation occurred within seconds. The soldiers didn't attack. They didn't even approach aggressively. Instead, a young corporal, he couldn't have been more than 20 years old, called out again in that broken Japanese, his hands clearly visible and empty. "Please come out. You will not be hurt. We have doctors. We have food." Food. The word hung in the air like something from a half-forgotten dream. The women hadn't eaten properly in 4 days. In truth, they hadn't eaten properly in months. The American advance through the Philippines had severed Japanese supply lines, reducing military rations to a few handfuls of rice per day, sometimes supplemented by whatever could be scavenged from the ruined city. Kimiko had lost 20 pounds since October. Her uniform hung loose on her frame, and her hands had developed a constant tremor from hunger. The other women looked no better, hollow-eyed, gaunt, their skins stretched tight over sharp bones. One woman began to weep. Another started to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Kimiko found herself standing without conscious decision, her legs shaking, the cyanide capsule falling forgotten from her hand to clatter on the floor. A flashlight beam illuminated the stairs. An American soldier descended slowly, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his hands extended to show they were empty. He was tall, they were all so impossibly tall, with freckles across his nose and a nervous smile. He looked, Kimiko would later recall, like a boy pretending to be a soldier, not like a demon at all. "Can you walk?" he asked in English, then struggled with Japanese. "Arukimasu ka?" They could walk. They emerged blinking into the harsh sunlight of Manila's burning streets, expecting at any moment for the facade to drop, for the violence to begin. Instead, they found themselves in a makeshift American field station where medics were treating wounded civilians and captured Japanese soldiers alike. An army nurse, an American woman in uniform, which itself seemed remarkable, approached with a canteen of water. She offered it to the closest Japanese woman, who stared at it as if it might be poisoned. The American nurse took a drink herself, then offered it again. "It's okay, just water, you're safe." That word again. Safe. Anzin. A concept that had ceased to have meaning months ago, when the American forces had begun their inexorable push toward the Japanese home islands. How could one be safe in the hands of the enemy? Yet here they were, being offered water, being led to shaded areas to sit down, being addressed with a courtesy that seemed incomprehensible given the circumstances. What the Japanese women couldn't understand, not yet, was that this was standard operating procedure for American forces. Field Manual 2710, Rules of Land Warfare, specified treatment of civilian detainees with considerable precision. More than that, the American command structure in the Pacific, under General Douglas MacArthur, had implemented specific protocols for handling Japanese civilians and non-combatant military personnel. These protocols emphasized immediate medical care, adequate food and water, and separation from combat prisoners who might still pose a security risk. MacArthur, whatever his other faults, understood that the eventual occupation of Japan would require winning hearts and minds, and that began with demonstrating that American intentions, however aggressive in combat, were not fundamentally barbaric. Within an hour of capture, Kimiko and the other women found themselves in a military truck being transported away from the front lines. They sat in tense silence, still waiting for the horror to begin. Instead, they arrived at a converted school building that had been designated as a civilian internment facility. Here, the second great shock awaited them: abundance. The gymnasium of the former school had been converted into a temporary mess hall. Long tables had been set up, and as the Japanese women were led inside, they saw something that seemed impossible: food. Not the watery rice gruel they had subsisted on for months, not the bitter wild greens gathered from bomb craters, not the occasional ration of dried fish so old it crumbled like paper. Real food. Hot food. American military rations in quantities that seemed obscene. Kimiko stared at the serving line in genuine incomprehension. There was bread, actual bread, white and soft, not the hardtack that crumbled into dust. There was meat, real meat, beef that had been cooked into a stew with potatoes and carrots. There were canned peaches, their syrup glistening gold under the electric lights. There were chocolate bars, coffee, powdered milk that was reconstituted into something creamy and sweet. The sheer quantity of it seemed vulgar, wasteful, impossible. Japan, which had been under severe rationing since 1942, could never have mustered such abundance even for its own frontline troops. Yet here it was, being offered to prisoners, to enemies, to women who hours earlier had been prepared to kill themselves rather than surrender. An American soldier speaking through a Nisei translator, a Japanese American in American uniform, which itself seemed like a betrayal of all natural order, gestured toward the serving line. "Please eat. Take as much as you want. There's plenty." Plenty? The word itself seemed foreign. There had been no plenty in the Japanese Empire for years. Everything had been rationed, controlled, distributed according to rigid hierarchies. Soldiers ate first, then male workers in essential industries, then everyone else according to their perceived value to the war effort. Women in Kimiko's position ate last and ate least. Even in peacetime, Japanese cuisine emphasized frugality, small portions, the aesthetic of scarcity. Now confronted with American military plenty, the women stood paralyzed. Finally, one of the older women, a former comfort station manager named Yuki Saito, shuffled forward. She took a tray with trembling hands and moved through the serving line. An American soldier, his face sweaty from the heat of the kitchen, ladled stew onto her plate with a generous hand, then added a thick slice of bread, then spooned peaches into a bowl. Yuki stared down at her tray as if it contained precious jewels. She returned to a table and sat down but didn't eat. She simply stared. Kimiko approached the line next. The smell of the food made her dizzy. Her stomach cramped with hunger so intense it was painful. The soldier serving her smiled, actually smiled, as if this were some normal social occasion, and filled her plate with the same generosity. When she hesitated, he added more, another ladle of stew, another piece of bread. "You're too skinny," he said through the translator. "Eat up. Build your strength back." Build your strength back. The implication was clear. They wanted the women to recover, to survive, to regain health. This ran counter to every narrative Kimiko had been fed. Enemies didn't feed you. Enemies didn't care if you were too skinny. Enemies certainly didn't encourage you to build your strength back. That was something a mother might say, or a concerned older brother, not a conquering soldier from a barbaric nation. Kimiko sat down at a table and forced herself to take a bite of bread. The taste exploded in her mouth, soft, slightly sweet, impossibly rich compared to the food she'd been surviving on. Tears sprang to her eyes unbidden. Around her, the other women were beginning to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing desperation. Some wept as they ate. Some ate so quickly they made themselves sick, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle such richness after months of deprivation. American medics moved among them with a practiced efficiency, warning them in simple Japanese to eat slowly, offering water, helping those who became ill. Over the next 3 days, as the women were processed and documented, the food continued to arrive with mechanical regularity. 3 meals a day, every day, in quantities that never seemed to diminish no matter how much was consumed. The American supply system, which had managed to feed millions of soldiers across 2 oceans, operated with a casual efficiency that seemed almost miraculous to those who had watched the Japanese supply network collapse into chaos and starvation. For Kimiko, the food became a symbol of something larger and more disturbing than simple material abundance. It represented a fundamental miscalculation in Japanese wartime ideology. The empire had portrayed Americans as soft, weak, decadent, a people too comfortable and too individualistic to sustain a long war. Yet here was evidence of an industrial and organizational capacity so vast that it could feed even its enemies as an afterthought, a routine administrative task requiring no special effort. If America could do this for prisoners, what resources did it command for its own forces? The implications were staggering and terrifying. But food was only the beginning of the dissonance. On the 4th day of captivity, American officials began conducting interviews with the women, trying to determine their roles in the military apparatus and gather intelligence about Japanese operations. Kimiko, as a trained nurse with some English capability, was among the first to be questioned. She was led to a small office where 2 American intelligence officers waited, along with the Nisei translator. She had been prepared for torture, for brutality, for sexual violence. Instead, one of the officers stood when she entered and gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down, Miss Tanaka." The courtesy title, the polite gesture, the simple acknowledgement of her humanity, it was all so jarringly inconsistent with everything she had expected. The interview lasted 2 hours. The officers asked about her nursing training, about the field hospital where she had worked, about the movement of Japanese troops and the location of military installations. Kimiko answered some questions, refused others, waited for the consequences of her refusal. They never came. When she declined to answer about troop movements, the officer simply made a note and moved on to another question. When she asked to stop for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion, they waited patiently, offered her water, gave her time to compose herself. At the end of the interview, one of the officers, a major with graying hair and a tired face, looked at her directly. "Miss Tanaka, I'm sure you've been told many things about Americans. I'm sure you've been frightened. I want you to know that you are safe here. You are a non-combatant and you will be treated in accordance with international law. You will not be harmed. When the war ends, you will be repatriated to Japan. Until then, you will be cared for." Cared for? The phrase seemed absurd. Enemies didn't care for each other. Yet the evidence of her own eyes, her own experience, suggested otherwise. That night, lying on a clean cot in the women's dormitory, another shock, they had been given actual beds with blankets. Kimiko tried to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she had been taught. The cognitive dissonance was painful, almost physical. If the Americans were not the demons they had been portrayed as, What did that say about the righteousness of the Japanese cause? If the enemy treated prisoners with basic human decency, what did that imply about the Japanese treatment of prisoners? This last question haunted her. Kimiko had worked in a field hospital that also treated prisoners of war, and she had seen things that now made her physically ill to remember. Allied prisoners had been denied medical care, left to die of treatable wounds, sometimes killed outright when they became inconvenient to transport. She had participated in this system, had accepted it as necessary, had told herself that these were legitimate consequences of war. Now, experiencing the opposite treatment from her captors, she was forced to confront her own complicity in what could only be called atrocity. The other women were experiencing similar crises of belief. In the dormitory at night, they talked in hushed voices, trying to make sense of their situation. Yuki Saito, the former comfort station manager, spoke of her confusion most openly. "I managed a comfort station in Burma," she told the group one evening. "I saw what happened to the women there, Korean girls, Filipino girls, Chinese girls. We treated them like animals, worse than animals. We told ourselves it was necessary for the soldiers' morale, that it was their duty to serve the empire. But if the Americans can treat us like human beings even though we're enemies, what excuse did we have?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. The women had been part of a system that dehumanized its victims, justified atrocities through ideology, and portrayed enemies as inherently evil. Now that ideology was crumbling under the weight of lived experience, the Americans were not evil. They were not demons. They were, disturbingly, just people, people who happened to be organized under a system that treated even enemies with a baseline level of human dignity. As weeks turned into months, and the women were transferred to a larger internment facility on Leyte Island, the full scope of American material and organizational capacity became increasingly evident. The camp was a small city unto itself, housing several thousand Japanese civilians and non-combatant military personnel. It had been constructed in a matter of weeks, prefabricated buildings erected with mechanical efficiency, supplied with electricity from portable generators, connected to a water system that provided clean drinking water, something that had become rare even in Japanese-held territories. The camp had a hospital staffed with American and Filipino medical personnel who treated internees with the same care they gave to American soldiers. Kimiko, with her nursing training, was allowed to work in the hospital, and there she witnessed medical practices that drove home just how far behind Japan had fallen in the material competition. The Americans had antibiotics, sulfanilamide, and by mid-1945, penicillin, that could cure infections that would have been death sentences in Japanese facilities. They had plasma for blood transfusions, anesthetics for surgery, X-ray machines that seemed like science fiction. They had so much medical equipment that some of it sat unused, waiting in storage for potential emergencies. Working alongside an American nurse named Helen Crawford, Kimiko slowly learned to articulate her confusion. Helen was from Wisconsin, 30 years old, married to a soldier fighting in Germany. She treated Kimiko not as an enemy or a prisoner, but as a colleague, teaching her American medical techniques with patient good humor. One day, as they were inventorying medical supplies, shelf after shelf of gauze, antiseptics, surgical instruments, Kimiko found herself asking the question that had been burning in her mind for months. "Why?" she asked in halting English. "Why you do this? We are enemy. We are nothing to you. Why you give us food, medicine, care? Why you not just let us die?" Helen paused in her counting, considering the question seriously. "Because you're human beings," she said finally, "and because that's who we are. We fight when we have to fight, but we don't make war on women and children. We don't make war on people who aren't fighting. That's the difference between us and—" She trailed off, perhaps thinking better of completing that comparison. But Kimiko completed it in her own mind. "That's the difference between us and you. Between American values and Japanese values. between a society that, for all its faults and contradictions, maintained some baseline commitment to human dignity, and a society that had subordinated all human value to the needs of the state and the glory of the emperor. The realization was crushing. Everything Kimiko had believed about the superiority of Japanese culture, the moral righteousness of the empire's mission, the decadence and weakness of America, all of it had been built on lies. Not small lies or exaggerations, but fundamental inversions of reality. The Americans were not weak, they were staggeringly strong. They were not morally bankrupt. They operated under ethical frameworks that, while imperfect, were demonstrably more humane than those of the empire she had served. They were not decadent. They were wealthy, yes, but that wealth translated into power, efficiency, and the capacity to extend basic human decency even to enemies. In August of 1945, news reached the camp that Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Kimiko and the other women learned about the atomic bombs, about the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, about the emperor's unprecedented radio address in which he told the Japanese people to endure the unendurable. For the women in the camp, the news brought not the despair one might expect, but a strange sense of relief. The nightmare was over. They would not die here. They would eventually go home, though what home would mean in a defeated Japan remained frighteningly unclear. In the months that followed, as arrangements were made for repatriation, the women were given access to American newsreels and newspapers. They saw images of the destruction in Japan, the firebombed cities, the atomic wasteland of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the millions of displaced and starving civilians. They learned about Japanese atrocities across Asia, about the death marches, the comfort women's system exposed in full, the medical experiments, the massacres. Much of this information had been hidden from them during the war, dismissed as enemy propaganda when hints of it emerged. Now the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. For Kimiko, the months after surrender were a time of profound psychological transformation. She had entered the war as a patriot, believing in the righteousness of Japan's cause. She had been prepared to die for the emperor, convinced that death was preferable to capture by the demonic Americans. Instead, she had discovered that her enemies were more humane than her own leaders, that the ideology she had served was bankrupt, and that her entire worldview had been constructed on systematic deception. The women began to talk more openly about what they had witnessed and participated in during the war. The comfort station managers spoke about the young girls who had been trafficked to serve Japanese soldiers, many of them teenagers, some even younger. The nurses spoke about how Allied prisoners had been treated, or rather, maltreated, in their hospitals. The administrators spoke about the resource exploitation in occupied territories, the forced labor, the deliberate starvation of civilian populations to feed the Japanese military. As they compared notes, a picture emerged of a system that had been genuinely monstrous, not in the cartoonish way propaganda portrays enemies, but in the banal, bureaucratic way that regimes implement atrocity as policy. And always serving as a constant counterpoint to these memories was the present reality of their treatment by American forces. They were still being fed 3 meals a day. They still had medical care. They were still treated with basic respect. When some of the women became pregnant, there had been men in the camp as well, and human nature continued even in captivity. They received prenatal care from American doctors. When a few women attempted suicide, unable to cope with the shame of survival and surrender, they were given psychological counseling. The Americans seemed genuinely committed to keeping them alive and as healthy as possible until they could be returned to Japan. The symbolism of food remained potent throughout this period. Every meal served was a reminder of American industrial capacity, of a system that could supply its armies across vast oceans and still have enough to feed prisoners. But it was more than that. The food represented a philosophical difference, a fundamental divergence in how the two societies conceived of human value. In the Japanese system, individuals had value only insofar as they served the collective, the nation, the emperor. In the American system, for all its imperfections and contradictions, there remained some irreducible core of individual human worth that deserved recognition even in enemies. Repatriation began in early 1946. Kimiko boarded a transport ship bound for Yokohama in February, along with hundreds of other Japanese civilians and former military personnel. The journey took 2 weeks, and during that time, the women were fed by American military cooks, housed in American military facilities, cared for by American military doctors. Even in this transitional space, the contrast with Japanese treatment of prisoners remained stark. Some of the older women, who had been in China during the 1930s, remembered how Allied prisoners had been transported, packed into cargo holds without adequate food or water, allowed to die of disease and neglect. Now they were being transported in the opposite direction, treated not as cargo, but as human beings in need of care. When the ship docked in Yokohama, Kimiko looked out at a country she barely recognized. The port facilities were largely rubble. The city beyond was a wasteland of charred wood and twisted metal. American occupation forces were everywhere, directing traffic, distributing food, managing the surrender with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to everything else. Japan, the great empire, the divine nation destined to rule Asia, had been reduced to a charity case dependent on the generosity of its conquerors. Kimiko made her way to her family's home in a suburb of Tokyo, a journey that took 3 days by train and on foot through devastated countryside. She found her parents alive but living in a shack built from salvaged materials, their neighborhood having been destroyed in the firebombing of March 1945. When she told them she had been a prisoner of the Americans, her mother began to weep, assuming the worst. When Kimiko explained that she had been well treated, that the Americans had fed her and cared for her and treated her with dignity, her parents stared at her in disbelief. "But we were told," her father began, then trailed off, unable to complete the thought. What had they been told? That Americans were demons, that capture meant torture and death, that surrender was worse than annihilation. All lies, all of it lies. In the months and years that followed, Kimiko struggled to rebuild a life in occupied Japan. She worked as a nurse in Tokyo, helping to treat civilians suffering from malnutrition and disease. She watched as American occupation forces implemented reforms, land redistribution, women's suffrage, the dismantling of the military-industrial complex, the rewriting of the Constitution to enshrine pacifism and democratic values. Some Japanese resented this imposed change, viewing it as a humiliation. But Kimiko, remembering her months in captivity, understood it differently. The Americans were trying to create in Japan the kind of society that could produce the material abundance and human decency she had witnessed in the camp. They were trying to prevent Japan from ever again falling into the kind of militaristic totalitarianism that had led to so much suffering. She married in 1948 to a man who had been a conscripted soldier and who carried his own burden of wartime guilt. They rarely spoke of their experiences, finding it too painful to articulate. But sometimes, late at night, Kimiko would tell him about the food in the American camp, about the hospital with its impossible abundance of supplies, about the nurse from Wisconsin who had treated her as a colleague rather than an enemy. And her husband would nod, understanding what she was really saying. We were on the wrong side. We served a lie. The people we thought were demons were more humane than we were. Decades later, in the 1980s, when Kimiko was an old woman and Japan had risen from the ashes to become an economic powerhouse, she was interviewed by a Japanese historian researching the experiences of women during the war. The historian asked what had most surprised her about American captivity. Kimiko thought for a long moment, remembering that basement in Manila, the terror, the cyanide capsule falling from her hand, the impossibly tall soldier with freckles calling out in broken Japanese, "You are safe now." "The bread," she said finally, "white bread, soft and sweet in such abundance that we could eat until we were full. We had been starving, dying slowly, believing we were about to be tortured and killed. Instead, they gave us bread. It seems like such a small thing, but it contained everything: their wealth, their organization, their basic humanity. We had been told they were demons, but demons don't feed you. Demons don't care if you're starving. The bread undid everything we had been taught. It showed us that we had been deceived, that we had served evil while believing we served good, and that the people we had been taught to hate were actually better than us. The historian pressed her. Better in what way? Kimiko considered this carefully. Not morally superior in some absolute sense. They had their own crimes, their own prejudices. I learned later about how they treated Japanese Americans during the war, the internment camps, the racism. But in this fundamental way, the way they treated even enemies who posed no threat, they demonstrated a commitment to human dignity that we had completely abandoned. We had turned ourselves into monsters in service of the emperor. They remained, somehow, fundamentally decent. That decency, that refusal to dehumanize us even though we were enemies, was more powerful than any weapon. It destroyed my faith in the empire more completely than any bomb could have. She paused, then added, "Sometimes I think that's what America really won the war with. Not the atomic bombs, not the superior industry, not the larger population or better resources. Those things mattered, of course. But what broke us, what really broke us, was the contrast between what we had become and what they remained. We expected demons and found human beings. That simple fact destroyed everything we had built our world on." The bread was just a symbol of it, but what a symbol it was. The story of Kimiko Tanaka and the 31 other Japanese women who were captured in Manila in January 1945 is not unique. Similar stories played out across the Pacific as Japanese forces collapsed and increasing numbers of civilians and non-combatant personnel fell into American hands. The experiences varied. Some camps were better managed than others. Some American units were more professional than others, and there were certainly instances of mistreatment and abuse. The United States did not conduct the war with perfect virtue, and individual soldiers sometimes committed crimes that were later prosecuted by military courts. But taken in aggregate, the pattern is clear. Japanese civilians and non-combatants who expected to be tortured and killed instead found themselves reasonably well cared for, fed adequately, treated with basic dignity, and eventually repatriated to Japan. This stood in stark contrast to how the Japanese military treated Allied prisoners and civilians in occupied territories, a treatment regime characterized by systematic brutality, deliberate starvation, forced labor, sexual slavery, and casual murder. The contrast was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was documented fact, evident in mortality statistics, in survivor testimonies, in the physical conditions of prisoners when they were liberated. For the Japanese women who experienced this contrast firsthand, it created a psychological crisis that many never fully resolved. They had been part of a system that portrayed itself as morally superior, as the defender of Asian peoples against Western imperialism, as the rightful leader of a new order based on traditional values and spiritual purity. Instead, they discovered that they had served a regime that was materially backward, morally bankrupt, and systematically deceptive to its own people. The American enemy, portrayed as decadent and weak, turned out to be wealthy, powerful, and, within certain limits, surprisingly humane. This was not the lesson Japanese propaganda had predicted. It was supposed to be the other way around. The spiritually pure but materially simple Japanese were meant to triumph through superior morale and willingness to sacrifice, defeating the soft, materialistic Americans who supposedly lacked the will to fight a hard war. Instead, the Americans demonstrated that material abundance and human decency were not weaknesses but strengths, that a society could be both wealthy and willing to fight, both powerful and somewhat humane, both individualistic and capable of sustained collective effort. The bread, the medicine, the clean water, the hospital beds, the courtesy titles, the simple acknowledgement of humanity. These were not accidents or examples of individual American virtue. They were products of a system, a society, an ideology that, for all its faults, maintained some connection to Enlightenment ideals of universal human rights and dignity. It was a system that could fight a brutal war when necessary, but didn't require the complete dehumanization of the enemy to do so. It was a system that could organize industry on an unprecedented scale, but could also remember that prisoners needed to eat. The women who experienced this firsthand became, in a sense, living critiques of the ideology they had served. Many of them, like Kimiko, spoke rarely of their experiences, finding them too painful and too psychologically destabilizing. They had built their identities around a set of beliefs that proved to be comprehensively false. They had been prepared to die rather than face a fate that turned out to be largely imaginary. They had participated in or witnessed atrocities, justified by an ideology that their enemies' behavior proved to be bankrupt. This cognitive dissonance created a particular kind of trauma, not the trauma of abuse suffered, but the trauma of discovering you had been on the wrong side, that your sacrifices had been for a lie, that the people you had been taught to hate were actually more worthy of respect than the people you had been taught to worship. It was a trauma of moral disorientation, of having your entire framework for understanding the world collapse under the weight of contradictory evidence. Yet out of this trauma came, for some, a kind of wisdom. Women like Kimiko became quietly but firmly committed to the democratic reforms of post-war Japan. They supported women's suffrage, having seen American women in positions of authority during their captivity. They supported pacifism, having seen the consequences of militarism up close. They supported the new Constitution with its famous Article 9 renouncing war, because they had learned that war, as Japan had fought it, was not glorious or noble, but simply monstrous. They became, without fanfare or recognition, part of the generation that rebuilt Japan as a fundamentally different kind of society. The irony was not lost on them. They had to lose the war, had to be conquered and occupied, had to have their ideology destroyed, in order to become citizens of a better country than the one they had fought for. The America that defeated Japan then turned around and helped rebuild it, pouring in aid through the Marshall Plan's Asian equivalent, establishing trade relationships, providing security guarantees. It was an unusual form of conquest, one that seemed genuinely interested in helping the defeated enemy rebuild as a prosperous democracy rather than as a subjugated colony. This too had to be reconciled with what they had been taught about American imperialism. The narrative of Western colonial exploitation was not entirely false. Japan's neighbors could attest to the real crimes of European and American colonialism in Asia. But the American occupation of Japan didn't fit that pattern. It was certainly an occupation,